Hello and welcome to La Progre. This is a YouTube channel about random facts and random stuff. Today I wanted to do a video about personal recommendations to prog rockers, to people who listen to progressive rock music. It's giving out some stuff that is not considered really progressive music. It's just something to expand your horizons, to listen to something different, just not the usual Emerson, Lake and Palmer, early Genesis, Yes, we enjoy those albums and I'm sure you listen to them quite a bit, but I just wanted to do something where you work with your curiosity. It's a top 15 albums that I consider very good music to look, and listen to stuff that transcends the regular progressive music label. First of all, I want to talk about the general conception of what prog rock is. To me, prog rock music was never about that extraordinary virtuosity, technical ability in anybody's instrument, musical instrument. Yeah, I enjoy listening quite a bit to people who can really do the Paganini stuff. To me, prog rock music was never about that. To me, prog rock really is related to that capacity to work within the boundaries of rock music, work something out that transcends that regular 4x4 backbeat, blues standard in rock and roll. Something that can take you further. Sometimes it has to do with diversity, with bringing in, folk music and some dramatic theatrical elements. I'm thinking about Jethro Tull, for example. Sometimes it has to do with those majestic, epic endings in 20-minute pieces. Yes, for example, Relayer, Tales of Topographic Oceans. And sometimes it's just about being quite experimental and avant-garde, like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from early Genesis. This list is intended for those of you who think, that way. Those of you who think that prog rock music is really about avant-garde, is really about experimentation, about transcending and transgressing just the normal boundaries of what rock music is. So here we go, let's do it. Coming in at number 15, this is one of my favorite all-time albums. It's really counter-progressive music, I will say. It's Austral Weeks by Van Morrison. This album is really extraordinary. It seems like Van Morrison just put himself in a situation, in the constraints of the studio scenario, and he worked a couple of chords with some lyrics, and he gave them to these musicians. He said, just do that for 6 minutes in each piece, and then he came out and sang on top of whatever these guys were doing. It sounds like that. That's not exactly the way it happened, but then again, it gives the music a feeling of spontaneity. It just sounds like it's been created right in the moment. Something that's very, very uncommon when you listen to prog music, which tends to sound really calculated. This music is as uncalculated, as spontaneous as it comes. Coming in at number 14, this is a really interesting album. It's a release from 1973. It's called For Your Pleasure. It's an album by the band Roxy Music. Now, that album apparently came out at a moment in which there was a lot of tension in Roxy Music, specifically between the two Brians, Brian Eno, the keyboard player, and Brian Ferry, the lead singer of the band. Apparently, Eno wanted the band to go more in an experimental path. Ferry just wanted to have, a regular rock and roll ensemble with some, glam rock elements. So this album really reflects that tension between these two creative minds. Let me just say, it's not as cohesive as their first self-titled album, and it's not the masterpiece that is Siren, and obviously it's not as enjoyable and accessible as it's going to be Avalon. But For Your Pleasure has a lot of songs that are really interesting, really experimental. And when you listen to that album, it really, really sounds like it foreshadows, the music foreshadows a lot of the stuff that's going to come in in the late 70s, early 80s. It actually foreshadows, a lot of music by bands like Duran Duran, techno music, in general, electronica, ambient music, mainly because of the input of Brian Eno. Coming in at number 13, this is one of my favorite albums in the list. It's called Another Green World by Brian Eno, the guy who played keyboard on For Your Pleasure by Roxy Music. After 1973, after For Your Pleasure, Brian Eno left Roxy Music and he started a number of projects that were independent projects. Some of his projects were, with other musicians like No Pussyfooting with Robert Fripp. I don't include that album in this list because it's quite progressive rock. But he did this album, Another Green World, which I really, really like. It's probably his most accessible album. It really sounds like a pop rock album. The only thing with it is be careful, because the first time I listened to it, I thought it had been released in the 1980s. It was not. It's an album from 1975, but the music sounds quite ahead of its time, in terms of construction, in terms of the mix, the general mix of the album, in terms of the keyboard sounds, synthesizers, which were Brian Eno's specialty. I mean, the album is really, really ahead of its time. So, at number 12, Transformer by Lou Reed. Now, many of you might be familiar with Lou Reed because of his collaboration with Metallica. It's an album called Lulu, if I'm not mistaken. That album is based on Wedekind's play, which is also the basis for the famous silent film Pandora's Box, German film. 1972, Lou Reed releases this album called Transformer. It's my favorite album of all his work. It's almost like a concept album. It's thought out as, the whole album, all of its music, it's related. It's really, really interesting. And for those of you who are prog rockers, I think this would be a nice entry point to Lou Reed's music. There are other Lou Reed albums which are certainly more experimental, but this one is probably within his accessible output, along with some, avant-garde inclinations that he had at the time. Really, really interesting stuff that came right after the Velvet Underground. If you haven't checked out the Velvet Underground, then I'll suggest you do that too. But Transformer, it's a great starting point for Lou Reed's music. At number 11, The Verve with A Storm in Heaven. Now, this album was released in 1993, but most of you, if you are familiar with The Verve, you'll remember them because of a song called The Bittersweet Symphony. Now, forget whatever you've heard from them, including that one song, and try out A Storm in Heaven. This album, probably one of the best albums out of the shoegaze scene. I would say, out of most of the albums done by bands that I consider shoegaze bands, like Ride and My Bloody Valentine, I would say this one is the one that I really, really go back to each and every time. A Storm in Heaven, it's really an interesting piece. It's all about mood. It's all about soundscapes, It's all about sitting and just listening to the whole thing from beginning to end. I must confess, I really enjoy this album when I'm jogging. So anyway, give it a try. Coming in at number 10 is The Unforgettable Fire by U2. Now, this was the beginning of U2's popularity. Right after this album came The Joshua Tree, which is probably the most popular album. However, if you've never listened to The Unforgettable Fire, I suggest you go back to that one. The real hero of this album is the guitar player. The Edge just sounds like a mastermind who's, inspired by the minimalist music of people like Philip Glass and Terry Riley. He uses reverb and delays to create these soundscapes. It's really, really interesting. Listen to songs like A Sort of Homecoming, Bad. Certainly, it's just those cascading sounds of guitar. Very unusual style in the guitar, but it really tells a story in the whole album, and I think he comes out victorious. It's really, really an extraordinary piece. Brian Eno's production of the album is really noticeable. It's an incredible, cohesive work, probably U2's most cohesive album. And it blends very well with the stuff that U2 was working at a time. You know, if you look at Boy, October, and A War, then you listen to The Unforgettable Fire. It's a departure from those early albums, but then again, it's quite a follow-up, and it foreshadows all of the stuff that the band was going to do afterwards. But it's probably their most experimental piece. So if you are into expanding the horizons once again, I think The Unforgettable Fire is something to consider.